Yes. I think we can start. Thank you again for coming to today's lecture, and it is my pleasure to welcome you on our fourth one, right, in this project. And Last time we talked about one of my favorite writers in Russian literature, Mikhail Bulgakov, and his novel The Master and Margarita. And today we will talk about the author that Bulgakov was considering to be his inspiration, his master, right? If Bulgakov was one of my favorite authors in Russian literature, Gogol is the favorite. So this is a big pleasure for me to talk about Gogol today. And Usually when we talk about Russian literature, we see these three men, right? We usually know Dostoevsky, Chekhov, and Tolstoy. And those are three authors that are mostly familiar to foreign people, right? Not Russian-speaking people. Those who don't study Russian literature at schools and just read Russian literature as foreign literature. Those three are, of course, really important, right? But they all come from one source, which is lesser known than these three people, but is known because of the operas, because of the different theater productions, who is Pushkin, right? We know Alexander Pushkin mostly for his Eugene Onegin opera, not even the Eugene Onegin poem, but the opera that was adapted. And Our today's hero is usually neglected, and that's very unfortunate, and that's what I want to sort of clarify today. But before we go into Gogol's life and work and everything, I want to move you to another dimension that is probably surprising, which is psychoanalysis, right? And this is Carl Gustav Jung, one of the two founding fathers, right, of the psychoanalysis, along with Sigmund Freud. And he discovered that there are some archetypes, right, of people's behavior, of people's personalities. And one of the most important archetypes that he found was the archetype of the fool or jester, right? And the fool or jester is the one who urges us, well, people, right, people around, to enjoy the process of our lives. Although the fool can be prone to laziness and dissipation, the positive fool invites us all out to play, showing us how to turn our work, our interactions with others, and even the most mundane tasks into fun. This is the definition of the fool archetype. And being born on April the 1st, right, the April Fool's Day, Nikolai Gogol is the embodiment of that archetype of the fool or the jester. And I'll try to explain why. First of all, yes, he is indeed able to find the most fun things in the most mundane things. And I'll try to give you some examples about that. And the first one of the first works he published was The Old World Landowners. And I really love this use of language here, and I'll try to explain why it looks so monstrous, probably for English-speaking eyes, right? So the quote is: "Pulcheria Ivanovna's room was furnished with chests and boxes and little boxlets and little chestletlets," right? Why is it? This is my translation, by the way, because unfortunately, the original, well, not the original, the official translation that this book of Gogol's has is not transferring that Gogol's idea into English language, because it is almost impossible, right? Because English language is very rare. Well, it is very rare to use the diminutive suffixes, right, in English language, but in Russian language is everywhere. Although I might need to say that in the modern time, using the diminutive suffixes is usually considered to be, well, mauvais ton, right? For adult people, it's usually used with in conversation with children. That's okay, or by children. That's fine. But when adults talk, it's usually not a very good thing to use diminutives. Uh, but Gogol does, and he does it masterfully. And he is exception to that rule, right? And always remember the title of our today's lectures. Gogol was always an exception to all the rules. And here I use two diminutive suffixes in the word cheslitlets, right? Because in Russian, you can do that. You can use several diminutive in one word, right? For example, the original, let me just, yeah, a little show. I always do those couple of questions before I go very deep into the lecture. How many of you foreigners here learn Russian or know Russian probably? So we have 3, 4, right? So you've probably seen that, you've met that, and I'm sure you found it horrible that those suffixes can add up to each other, right? So the word box in Russian is, well, in this case it's ящик. It's usually коробка, but in this case it's ящик, right? And boxlet in Gogol's text is ящичек. So the Czech suffix is a diminutive, right? Chest is sunduk, right? But then chestlet is sunduchok. But in Gogol's text is sunduchochek. Right, that's why it's chestletlet, right? it's even smaller. And the thing is, Gogol, from the very beginning, Gogol loved to find magical things, fun things, in the most minute and the most mundane little things, right? He loved those little things. And that's why he draws our attention to those chestletlets, because they are even more important than chests, right? Boxlets are more important than boxes, right? Because they're smaller and they sort of they look magical to him. Big things scare him, but small things, they look magical to him. Yeah, and that love of using that simple like folk language, right? That's what makes him real fun to read. There's also one thing that I want to say about the archetype of the jester is that Jung tells us that when the jester reaches its peak, it becomes the sage, right? And Gogol became a sage quite early in his life, and then in the same work, in the Old World Landowners, he introduces us to the singing doors, and there where the magic of Gogol begins. And I would like to read to you well, it's not a very short extract, but it is a wonderful example of how Gogol introduces magic into the most mundane things. But the most remarkable thing in the house was the singing doors. As soon as morning came, the singing of the doors was heard throughout the house. I can't say why they sang, whether it was because the hinges were rusty or because whoever made them installed some hidden mechanism. But what was remarkable was that each door had its own particular voice. The door leading into the bedroom sang in the thinnest of trebles. The door to the dining room wheezed in a bass. But the one in the entrance hall emitted a strange sort of tinkling and at the same time moaning sound, so that listening to it, you eventually heard very clearly, "Oh, I'm so cold." I know that many people don't like that sound at all, but I'm very fond of it, and if here from time to time I happen to hear the squeaking of doors, then all at once I smell a country village, a low little room lit by candle in an old-fashioned candlestick, supper already on the table, a dark May night looking in from the garden through the open window at the table with its place settings, a nightingale pouring a resonant song over the garden, the house and the distant river, the fright and rustle of the branches, and Lord, what a long string of memories wafts over me then. That magic of singing doors, this small extract from the old world landowners, just shows how those small things can become magical. And this is what Marcel Proust will use, right? Many years after, 100 years after, uh, in his In Search of the Lost Time, when the small sound can make you remember the whole life, right? That work of memory, that sensual memory, right? Whether it be sounds or smells or whatever. So that magic that or magic of his that he uses to make inanimate objects alive, right? He makes them sing, he makes them speak. In another work of his, and the most important work of his, The Dead Souls, he introduces us to this character on the ride. His name is Sabakevich, and as you can see, he looks quite huge and bulky, right, and square. And when the main character comes to his house to have a dinner and talk business, he sees the furniture there, and the furnishing of the room where they dine is quite well. There are few things, right? Not many, but the things that present there, they all look square and huge and bulky. And then the main character says, they scream, I am too Sabakevich, right? The wardrobe, the cupboard, the table, they all speak, I am too Sabakevich, right? So that is the magic of Gogol's. He finds those things. He says, yes, the soul of the owner of the things, right? It goes, the part of it goes into the things that they own, and they also become oneself, right? That's why the table, the wardrobe, the cupboard, all those things are to Sabakevich. And many people think, unfortunately, I might say, that especially because of Dead Souls, that Gogol was a master of satire, that he was laughing at all of those people, he was making them look bad. But indeed, he loved them. He loved all those people that he described. And this feeble, messy, and dirty, and sweet tooth Nikolai Gogol, while describing weak people, small people, messy people, dirty places, he made them sound sweet somehow. Yet that's the magic of Gogol. And I also have another example from the Dead Souls, just to prove how sweet it is when he describes things that are messy and dirty and puny. Um, Sabakevich was the fourth landowner that the main character Chichikov visits, but the last one was the most terrible one, right? And the most dirty one and the most messy one. And his name was Plushkin, and when the main character comes to Plushkin's manor, he passes by this sort of a bridge made of wood, panels, right? And those wood panels were so old and in such a bad condition that they were, like that. It wasn't a smooth road to move on. It was a very bad, rough road, right? See how he describes that. Chichikov's amusement at the peasant's outburst prevented him from noticing that he had reached the center of a large and populous village. But presently a violent jolt aroused him to the fact that he was driving over wooden pavements of a kind compared with which the cobblestones of the town had been as nothing. Like the keys of piano, the planks went up and down, and an unalarmed passenger going by the pavements would get either a bump on the back of the neck or a bruise on the forehead, or it even could happen to bite over painfully on the tail of one's tongue. So first of all, he compares that messy road, right, to the keys of the piano, which is absolutely magical, right? It doesn't tell us, oh, it was so bad, I was, trembling like that, and I hit my head, or I don't know, I bit my tongue. He doesn't tell us that. He tells that it was like a piano was going up and down, right? It's just that fun. But then he uses those nice words. Again, this is also my translation. That's why it's a little bit strange. But he uses those words over painfully, right? In Russian, it's прибольно, right? And then he says, which is even in Russian is wrong, sounds wrong. It doesn't say the tip of the tongue. It says the tail of the tongue, right? Because in Russian, if we say the tip of the tongue, it should be кончик языка, the word кончик, right? But Gogol uses хвостик языка. He uses the word tail of the tongue, which even in Russian sounds terrible. But while sounding terrible, it sounds magical indeed. He uses his language he uses language as if it was his own property, right? It doesn't obey to those rules that were established, right? Yes, that's the way we speak. No, he says, I can speak whatever I want, right? So we see that, Dead Souls is one of his last works. Obviously, he was a master by that time. But let's talk how he became like that, how he come to be the master of that very different, exceptional language and skill of narrative, right? So to do that, we need to dive into the historical context a little bit. And in the early 18th century, the problem with, as I see it as a problem, but obviously people back at that time didn't. The problem with Russian literature was that there still, there wasn't one single novel written in Russian language by the end of the 18th century, right? So there were different types of genres developing in Russian literature. We'll talk about them a little bit later, but no novels. There were already novels in France and Germany, right? In in English language, in Spanish, of course, with Don Quixote, right? So the whole European literature was developing the genre of novels, but Russian wasn't. And even Mikhail Lomonosov, one of the biggest polymaths in history and definitely the biggest polymath in Russian history, he said Russian people are in no need of novels, right? They don't need that genre. That genre it's too time consuming, right? To read a big novel, you need a lot of time. And it doesn't bring any use, they thought. Even Lomonosov was saying that God gave us two books, one where he showed his might and the second one where he showed his mercy, right? The Old and the New Testaments. You don't need other books, right? But there were some literary genres that were developing in the 18th and in the 18th century, and there were four of them. The first one was hagiography, which is the life of saints, right? And the best example is Archdeacon Habakkuk, or as we call him, Avakum, right, in Russian. It was high poetry, yes. There were odes and, those nice poems about kings and queens and emperors and empresses, etc., etc. And again, the biggest example of it was Gavrila Derzhavin. Drama was quite a good thing in Russian, in Russian literature, and Denis van Vizen is one of the good examples of it. And short stories. They used to write short stories. And Nikolai Karamzin was one of the greatest short story writers in the 18th century. But no novels, right? Nothing that you can spend a whole lot of time reading. People loved drama because they loved theater. People liked poetry because they could read it quickly, right? People loved hagiography because they were Christians, very avid Christians. And short stories, again, you don't need to spend a lot of time. You need to spend more time on reading the Bible, the scriptures, and everything, right? That's why no novels. Of course, there were. I mean, even in the most, in the purest of the societies, there are always rebels, right? And there were some rebels who did write novels, but there is one but. Those novels were sort of parodies, or sometimes even just plagiarisms from famous European novels. Okay, they were not originally Russian. They were just, sometimes even, well, not translated because that would make the novel the same, but they took something from the famous European novel, right, that was famous back at that time, and then they gave some characters Russian names and then just went with it. For example, there was a famous author back at that time, at the end of the 18th century, Vasily Narezhny, and he wrote the novel that was called Russian Gil Blas. And Gil Blas is a very famous novel by the French author Alain René Lesage, right? And yes, so they didn't even hide that fact. Is that Russian Gil Blas, right? It's not. Sorry. Sorry. Yep. Something. Yep. Yes. Sorry for that.
We can see him perfectly.
Yeah. So Vasily Narezhny, yeah, and he was one of the many. People would just copy and plagiarize and adapt and parody a lot of different European novels, but no one was writing a proper Russian novel until Gogol, right? And the first thing that he published, well, by the way, he also fell into that trap of parodying or adapting European books into Russian, because he wrote a book named Hans Kuchelgarten, mainly inspired by Johann Voss and Friedrich Schiller, romantic poets and playwrights. And he didn't even put his name there. He used his pen name V. Alov, because he wasn't sure about that quality of the thing, and he didn't want to sort of put his name into dirt, right? That's why he used another pen name. But that work was terrible. He bought out all the copies himself, right? None of the copies was sold, and he bought all. I'm sorry? Yeah, it became a bestseller. Yeah, he bought out all the copies by himself, burnt them. Somehow, one of the copies was saved, but he burned almost everything that he was able to find about that book. And then he thought of writing a proper Russian novel, right? But it would take more time than he thought. But before that, he did indeed publish his first book that he now used his name on, right? His real name on. And that was a very funny story because he was, back at that time, he was traveling to Italy sometimes, but mostly he spent his time in Niezhin, which is a city, or sort of a village in Ukraine, where he was studying and then teaching. By the way, he was a prolific teacher in history and philosophy. And he wrote to his mother, who was a landowner in Karpaty, it was a mountainous area, right? And he said, "Can you please gather all the folklore tales, whatever it is, from the there was a thing which is it's not easily translated into English, which is krepostные, right? Which are like enslaved peasants, sort of, right? because Russian slavery is a little bit tricky. They didn't enslave the foreigners; they enslaved their own people, and so the krepostные are those enslaved peasants. But his parents were quite good landowners. They loved their own peasants. And so he said, would you please gather all the folklore from them, all the fairy tales and everything? And so his mom did, and she sent him a big letter with all those materials. And he collected them and he worked with them. And then this book was published. Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, his first ever published book, well, by his name, right? Not V. Alov. And this book would go into the history as one of the most magical and beautiful books ever. And funny thing here, and we need to talk about that a little bit. This is Gogol's quote. The only thing that could work with, sorry, that I could work with well, was what I took from reality, from what was known to me. And the thing is, this book is full of magical beings and creatures and those things, right? But then he claims that he took all his inspirations from reality and what was known to him. And that brings us to a very important thing. And that is a very important thing to, in order to understand his books, well, in a proper way. He believed in magic. Indeed, he was a magical person, a very mystical even, I would say. And he didn't think of magic as something surprising, as something that would bash a person who is witnessing magic, right? His characters, when they witness magic, they feel absolutely okay. They do not show any surprise. They are not confused about it. They're just, okay, that's just magic. And the first sentence of this is, by the way, it's a collection of short stories. And one of those short stories, and probably the most famous short story out of that collection, is Night Before Christmas. And the first sentence of The Night Before Christmas tells us that, well, it's a, well, not the first sentence, but the first paragraph. It tells us about how the night came right before Christmas, and the winter was great, and the snow was great, blah, blah, blah. And he explains the village. But then he tells this story of that from one of the chimneys, the witch, obviously on a broomstick, she occurred, and with some smoke, she was flying. And then he says, and again, the magic starts right from the beginning, but then he says the most funny thing possible, probably, because he says, even if, well, I mean, if the governor of Sorochince, which is the place, if the governor of the Sorochince would pass by when she was flying, right, he would have noticed her because she was so low, she was flying very low. And then he says, very funny thing, because no witch can glide away from the governor of Sorochince, right? It is a normal thing for the governor to be hunting witches, obviously, right? So, so that talent of his to mix the magical, a witch, and the most mundane, which is governor of Sorochince, which is a very small place in Karpaty, Ukraine. And obviously the governor of Sorochince is just a puny, very petty statesman, right? It's not a big deal to be a governor of Sorochince, but he was so great at hunting witches that no witch could glide away from him. So that talent of his, again, to mix the magical and the mundane, and it to seem easy, right? For us readers, and we read about this governor, yeah, I'm sure that no witch could glide away from him, right? Yeah, he probably hunted down a lot of witches. Yeah, that's an example of how magical is being normal in Gogol's tales. Another thing, well, episode from the same story, The Night Before Christmas, is when the main character Vakula, he wants to find a devil, right? He wants to find it's not the devil, but it's just a small type of a devil. He wants to find him to so that small devil can help him get to the where Petersburg, right, or whatever, to see the Tsarina, so that she can give him her nice shoes, so that he can bring those shoes and give it as a gift to his fiancée, right? And that's when they can get married. That's the main plot. And so but he doesn't know how to find the devil, and so he comes to Patsuk, it's the name of the character, and he is sort of a sorcerer, a local sorcerer, a wizard, right? And he comes to him so that he can show where he could find the devil. And there's a scene in the film adaptation. It's a Soviet film adaptation that I would like you to see. And the moment Vakula comes into the house of Patsuk, he sees a very funny scene. But again, well, let's see it. Okay, let's see it now. I'll show you. But then I'll tell you about the reaction of Vakula about it, right? Um, So this is a short scene where Patsuk eats the galushki, which is like Ukrainian dumplings. He eats galushki, and Vakula comes right at that time, and he doesn't think, oh wow, it's magic. Oh, he can manipulate it with telekinesis or whatever it's called, manipulate the dumplings. No, he just thinks, oh man, this one is even lazier than Choop. Choop is another character that he doesn't like. He said, this one is even lazier because Choop at least uses, spoon to eat. This one just doesn't move his hands, right? Like, so it's not the magic, it's the sloth of Patsuk what fascinates him, right? Like, oof, it's so lazy, right? And so, yeah, and that's again an example of how magic is being normal in Gogol's tales. And I'm sorry, yeah. Another magical novella of his is the V. The V is a collective name for all those undead demonic creatures in Ukrainian or Carpathian folklore. And the main character of it is Homa Brut or Hama Brut, and the name Hama is actually a dialectic changing of the name Thomas, right? Because it's Fama in Russian, but then it's Thomas, actually Thomas in English. And Brut, of course, comes from Brutus, that one counselor of Caesar, right? And again, here Gogol shows what happens to a person who is not in intimate relationship with magical. Because and this is one of the few books where his main character is despised by himself, right, by Gogol. Because Gogol despises Homabrut. He thinks that he's so puny, he's so stupid that he doesn't see the beauty in the magical creatures. He doesn't see the beauty in supernatural. He's afraid of it, right? Vakula wasn't afraid of Patsuk when he saw that he was doing those manipulations with dumplings. He was saying, like, oh, he's so lazy, right? But he wasn't afraid of him. No, he liked the magic. And he wasn't afraid of a devil. Actually, he rode a devil, right? To fly to St. Petersburg. So he wasn't afraid. He was strong enough and faithful enough to see the magical and to understand it and to befriend it. But when a person is afraid of the magical, that's what happens. And in the V, Homobrute actually dies at the end when he shows his fear towards the V, right? And that is actually Gogol's message to us. If you're afraid of the supernatural, if you are afraid of the magical, that's your end, right? You need to be in that friendly, intimate relationship with the magical to survive, to strive in life, right? To and those who are afraid of it, they die. So the salvation of people, we would say, is in understanding of the magical, right? In being in intimate relationship. But then he goes very, very deep into it, and he writes a story of Taras Bulba. Taras Bulba was the chieftain of Cossacks and the one who led the war, well, not the war, but a few battles against the Polish armies, right? And many people think that this, and I can understand why they think that, but I'm very sad because of that fact that people think that this is a patriotic novella. They think that this book is about a strong man who was fighting the enemy and he was protecting his own land and etc. 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 But this is not about it. Yes, it is about a strong man, but it is about a strong man who believed in God, and that was his main strength, right? He was in. There's even a as you can see here on the cover of the book, there's even an episode when he kills his own son, his younger son, Andri, because he betrayed his army, right? Because he went to the Polish side. And that's why he kills him. And he says, yeah, that sacramental phrase, yeah, I fathered you, thus I shall kill you, right? Um, and but again, this is not a book about patriotism. It's the story of salvation because the main episode, the main scene of the book, comes at the very end, and in that scene we can understand what Gogol was trying to say. This is actually a story. Well, funny enough, probably, but this is a story of Jesus, right? Because when Taras Bulba was executed and they burned him alive, he was seeing how Polish armies, they sort of corner his own squads, right? His own platoons. And he was trying to help them, and because he was seeing quite far because it was on the mountain, right? And he was calling for them. Yeah, so let me read again the extract of it. Take stands, brothers, he shouted, of the hillock behind the wood. They cannot climb it. But the wind did not carry his words to them. They're lost, lost in vain, he said in despair, and glanced down to where the water of the Dniester glittered. Joy gleamed in his eyes. He saw the sterns of 4 boats peeping out from behind some bushes, exerted all the power of his lungs, and shouted in the ringing tone, to the bank, brothers! Descend the path to the left, under the cliff! There are boats on the bank. Take all of them, he said. Right? So and now wind carries his words to his men, and they hear him finally, and they turn to the riverbank rather than going to a corner where the Polish people were waiting for them, Polish armies. So this tells us that nature was against the war, right? Because when he said, take a stance, take that hillock, what he meant was actually sort of go to that mountain, right? Regroup, because the Polish armies it would be very difficult for Polish armies to go through that wood because, I mean, they knew the territory, right? The Cossacks knew it was their territory. So he said, go there, regroup, that's how we understand it, right? And then you can strike back. But his voice was unheard by his men because wind didn't carry his voice, right? But then he saw the water, and then he says them, flee, do not fight, right? He saw water and joy gleamed in his eyes. He understood that finally, a moment before his death, he understood what was right. It wasn't right to fight, it was right to flee, right? Because, yeah, he was a strong chieftain, right? But in the final moment of his life, he understood that war is not something that can lead to a better future, right? And he chose peace. He chose his armies to flee by the waters. And let us now talk a little bit about the symbolism here in this scene. I'm sure you know what the symbols of mountain and river mean, right? Mountain is the symbol of aggression, right? Is a phallic symbol, as psychologists would say, right? Is a symbol of strength, right? Is a symbol of, but it's also a symbol of conservation, of stability, right? River is the symbol of movement. River is the symbol of cleaning, right? It's something that Russian people needed there. Gogol understood that, right? You do not need to go to war. Yes, you can take a stance of that mountain. You can regroup and then attack back, but that will lead to nothing. The salvation of Russia is in water, is in river that was blessed, right? River is a symbol of all the cleaning, right? It's been blessed by, well, Jordan, the river Jordan was blessed by Jesus Christ, who was baptized there, right? The river Dniester was blessed by the fact that Taras Bulba was executed near it. And he sort of shouts them, yes, there is your salvation. Go there, flee, do not fight, right? Which is very uncharacteristic of him. Because Taras Bulba was never the one to escape the fight. He was always ready to go into the heat of the war, right? But then in the final moment of his life, he understood, the main thing probably. So it's not a book of patriotism. It's not a book of fighting for your land. It's the book of sometimes you need to flee. Sometimes you need to go down the river so that you be cleaned and escape war. And if you can do that, you need to always do that, right? And after that starts what we can call, vaguely, but we can call Gogol's philosophy. After this book, he becomes a sort of a very, very deep, very deepened into Christian thoughts, into Christian philosophy. And he goes to St. Petersburg. He is a good friend of Pushkin back at that time. He teaches there in funny enough in the College of Patriotism. Yeah, he teaches history, world history mostly, and he thinks of religious philosophy and he thinks of a true message of Jesus. And he even writes once to his friend, he said that God gave us a church, and that church is, we haven't made that church a part of our lives yet, he says, right? We're trying to do something else. We're doing anything but what Jesus said to us, right? He says. And now he focuses on, what Jesus did, right? Helping little people, helping those miserable people who are forgotten by everyone. And thus comes to life the novella The Overcoat, sometimes known also as The Cloak. And he writes this novella in the style of hagiography, as normally the Russian Orthodox Christians would write hagiography or the life of the saints, right? He writes the life of a small statesman, or as it would be known afterwards as a little man. And that little man has a dream. that little man has a dream to buy or to order, probably, a nice overcoat. He doesn't have any money to do that, so for half a year, he saves money as he can, right? Sometimes not eating, sometimes not buying even the most necessary stuff. So he tries to save the money to buy a new overcoat, and then he dreams about it. He dreams of the materials that he would use in order to make his, the color, etc., etc. And then he buys it, and he becomes the happiest man alive, right? And he comes to work and he shows off and he says, "See what I've got. See what is. It's great, right?" And then one of his bosses calls him for dinner. And then he goes there because he cannot reject the boss's invitation, right? He goes there and then he becomes very drunk. And when he comes back home, he is robbed. And robbers, or the mobs, right? They take his overcoat. And of course, he panics. He's depressed. He comes to work. He's laughed at. Because people are like, oh, okay, right? You were showing off, you're bragging about your new overcoat. Where is it now? And he tries to sort of, investigate it, tries to find those robbers. And one of his friends tells him that recently a very distinguished gentleman was appointed to a new position of general. We don't know the name of the person. He's known as the distinguished gentleman. And Akaki Akakievich, that's the name of the main character of this little man. He goes to this distinguished gentleman and he says, "Can you please try to find those people who robbed me, blah, 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 blah." And that person, by the way, being not a bad person at all, he is a kind one, but that swift promotion to the position of general sort of, I think he was having some rabbits in the headlights or something. He became a little bit confused, right, in the worst of ways. So he was very rude to the main character, and he didn't want to help him at all. And the next day, Akaki Akakievich falls ill because of his stress and then dies a few days later. And after a week or so, or 10 days, people start hearing about his death. First of all, they start noticing that he's not there, right? Because before that, they didn't even notice his presence. And they start noticing that he wasn't there, sorry. And the distinguished gentleman also hears about his death. And he's very sad about that. But he cannot do much. So he chooses to sort of drink it up, right? He says, "Okay, I'll go partying so that I can forget about that thing." And so he goes partying. But when he goes there, he's stopped by a very familiar person. And he sees, on the right page you can see, and he sees in that man, he sees Akaki Akakievich. And turns out that after death, he became a vengeful spirit, a ghost that hunts people for their overcoats. But when he hunts people, but then when he sees their faces, he takes their overcoats, but then he just sends them away, right? Just leave, and they flee, of course, and they become not fascinated, but shocked about that. But here he says, "Finally, that's who I was looking for." Right? And then he takes his overcoat, and again he sends him away. He lets him live, but then this man becomes kinder to his subordinates, and that's a little romantic side of Gogol, right? He needed to show that this man, after meeting this vengeful ghost, he became kinder, right? And then one of the witnesses said that he saw Akaki Akakievich leave forever because now he's made his revenge, right? Yes. What is happening?
Your laptop is not connected to Wi-Fi.
It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be.
Historical.
Yes. But then that witness who saw the ghost of Akaki Akakevich leave forever, he said that he looked taller than usual and he had bigger hands because he was following that person, that witness was following the ghost, but then he sort of turned around and said, "Go away, right? What do you want from me?" And then he left. And so this is actually the reference to the book of Matthew, right? And the first shall become last, and the last first, right? And yes, the smallest of men, the one that was even not acknowledged with his presence, not well, yet, let alone his achievements, that person became a tall and strong and powerful, vengeful spirit after death. So yeah, that was Gogol's attempt to show the life of the small people, right? Of those people who are in the conditions of big cities are invisible because he's coming from a small village, right? People there know each other. People there care about each other. Care about each other. People that there are no invisible people in the village. But then he comes to a big city, and remember, Petersburg was the capital back at that time, right? And it was much bigger than anything that Gogol would see before. And he saw those small people that were invisible, and now he started caring about them. And he this very novella, this very story would lead to one of the most famous writers in Russian history, Fyodor Dostoevsky, right? Because that was the one who sort of enriched that idea of writing books about little men. And Poor Folk, his first book, was sort of an homage to Dostoevsky. And even on one of the occasions, Dostoevsky said the very famous phrase that he said, "We all come from under the Gogol's overcoat." Right? So the whole Russian literature, the whole Russian prose, especially that bit of it that is talking about the miserable people, the invisible people, the little people, that all comes from Gogol's overcoat. So that's one of the biggest contributions of Gogol to the Russian literature, and even not only Russian, by the way, might I say, it's global because after that we'll see Charles Dickens, right? Who read Gogol and who knew his works, and that helped him to sort of make a decision to go into that direction, right? To write about small people, and then the whole American literature would go that way, right? After Dickens, because there are a lot of different authors in American literature that write about small people, invisible people. But the main work of Gogol's is, of course, Dead Souls. We already talked a little bit about it, but let's talk a little more. I call it with two names. I call it the Odyssey of the 19th century. Not only me, but it's called the Odyssey of the 19th century, and I'll explain why. And also Gogol's Inferno. Again, I'll explain why. So let's start with the Odyssey. Who is the Odysseus? Who is Odysseus? Is a wandering, traveling trickster, right? A hero who seeks for wonders, for miracles, right? And the main character of the Dead Souls is also a trickster. He's a traveling trickster who tries to work miracles, work magic. And there have been a lot of different types of Odysseus during the history, during the development of literature. So let's look at some of those with respect to their eras, right? So obviously, the Odysseus of the ancient era is the Odysseus himself, right? Heroic demigod king. That's the highest, the highest position that a character can hold, and the Odysseus, the first Odysseus ever, is that, right? The next Odysseus is Dante, right? The Odysseus of Renaissance. He can in Renaissance you cannot be a heroic demigod king. The Renaissance is a very Christian-oriented era, right? So that's why our Odysseus now becomes a loving philosopher, right? He searches for love, right? Because why did he choose to go with Virgil? Because Beatrice was there waiting for him, right? And so he goes through the hell and purgatory and paradise to see his beloved Beatrice. And then the Odysseus of New Era is a saint knight. Again, because it's not the era of philosophers, it's the era of people who try to do things, right? That's new era. A lot of things are being developed. The Americas, both Americas were discovered, right, back at that time. And so this is the time where active people were sort of favored, right? So that's why we have this mad person who has nothing to do in his life, but he decides to go into that conquest, right, to find his beloved Dulcinea, who is actually probably even not existing. But he does things. He fights different creatures, although they are not creatures, right? Some windmills and etc. So the Odysseus of New Era is Don Quixote, right? The Saint Knight. The Odysseus of the Enlightenment period is adventurous Doctor Lemuel Gulliver, right? The one who goes to the Lilliput and then the Brobdingnag. It's always very difficult to say that. And so he's an adventurous doctor. Again, it's the time of active people, but now it's enlightenment, right? It's the time of smart people, of sort of scientists, right? That's why he becomes a doctor. The Odysseus sort of is being reborn as an adventurous doctor. Then we come to the era of Romanticism. The year of Romanticism is a period of tired people. For two different periods we've now been, well, people have been active, right? We had a new era, a very active era, and then Enlightenment, again, a very active period. So people are tired to be active. And so now we have the new Odysseus, who is Childe Harold, right? The Lord Gordon Byron's Childe Harold, who is a wary rebel. He is a rebel in his very deep nature, but he's too tired to be a rebel anymore, right? But now it's 19th century. So who is going to be our new 19th century's Odysseus? It should be an active person again, right? Because 19th century, the industrialization begins, right? The whole different types of conflicts occur in the world. And so it should be an active one, but it shouldn't be a noble person, by the way, right? Before that, everybody we see, including Childe Harold and Lemuel Gulliver and everybody in between or before them, were noble people, right? Odysseus was a king, Dante was a noble person, and then Don Quixote was a noble person. He was Hidalgo, right, which is a sort of noble title, and Gulliver also came from, yeah, sort of poor but noble family, and Childe Harold is of course also noble. He's a lord, but this person should not be a noble, but he should want to be a noble, right? He should want to have a title. And that's why in the 19th century, Gogol creates Pavel Chichikov, a selfish schemer. And what is the scheme of Chichikov? What is the main plot of The Dead Souls, and why is this novel called like this? So Pavel Chichikov, he is not a noble, as I said. He is not a noble, but he wants to become. He wants to become an aristocrat. And for that, he needs to have a big house, right? Money and peasants, right? He needs those things, but he doesn't have any of those. He doesn't have it. He has no, like, neither money nor house nor nor peasants. So he decides to go down the different villages and see different landowners, and using the fact that quite um, it's not been very long since the last sort of registration of peasants, right? I mean, sorry, it's been long since the last registration of the peasants. And the problem is when, like, probably like every 10 years or so, there was a registration of the peasants, right? So if you're a landowner, you need to go to the registry and all people from the registry come and see how many male peasants you have. Unfortunately, they were counting only male people. And then during those 10 years before the next registration, people would naturally die, right? Some people would naturally die. But before that next registration, the landowners would usually not sort of make it official, right? So because their people that their people died, and especially because they were just lazy. Like they didn't want to trouble themselves with writing to the registry office. Oh, that and that and that died this year, right? No. So officially, they had as many peasants as they were present at the registration period. And Chichikov knows that. He knows that their actual number of peasants is smaller than the official number. And then he goes around all those villages and sees all those landowners and said, I can buy your dead souls. That's why they called like that, right? Dead souls. I can buy your dead souls because you don't need them, right? You pay taxes for them every year, but they are dead. Let me buy those. And the landowners, at first, they were sort of skeptical about it, but then they were, yeah, sure, because, yeah, again, we pay taxes for the dead people. Why don't we just sell them so he pays taxes for them, not me, right? And yeah, he buys those dead souls. Why? Because then he can come to the bank, and banks only occurred back at that time, and so they weren't very thorough about the criminal records and everything. And so he would go to the bank and show them that he has so and so peasants, so they could give him a loan because that's a bail, right? He can bail those dead souls as if they were real people. So that was his scheme. And then he roams in those 5 villages. And he goes through 5 villages to see different landowners. And that's why I call this story, apart from calling it the Odyssey of the 19th century, I call this story Gogol's Inferno. Unlike Dante's Inferno, that has how many? 13 layers, right? Gogol's Inferno has 5. Each landowner is a representative of Gogol's own version of the deadly sins. It's not the Dante's deadly sins. It's a different thing, specific to Russian people, right? Russian deadly sins. And yes, he sees those 5. The Chichikov is obviously in the middle, and he sees those 5 different landowners, and we'll go one by one and describe their sins from the most pleasant one to the most outrageously appalling one, right? So the first one that Chichikov meets is a landowner by the name of Manilov, and his deadly sins are servility and hypocrisy. Servility, because Manilov is the person who made through his life by flattery, mostly, right? He knows how to please people. He knows how to make them like him. But he also seems very nice to people. He's a master of it. He likes when people like him, and but he is actually probably the stupidest one. He is actually the most, not probably the most, but one of the most shallow ones, right? And that's where hypocrisy comes into, because being a shallow and a stupid person, he likes to seem as if he is an intellectual and a very cultured and well-mannered person, right? He calls his 2 kids. He has 2 sons. He calls them with ancient Greek names, Themistocles and Alkid, right? Yeah, he doesn't know anything about those. He knows nothing about who is Themistocles, right? But he heard that name and look, okay, I'm gonna name that my son. So servility and hypocrisy are the sins that Gogol sees in people like Manilov, and they're legion. Okay, the people like Manilov are a huge number in Russia back in the 19th century, and that's the matrix that he builds. He sees five different archetypes of rich people in Russia, right? And he describes those five different archetypes. The first one is servility and hypocrisy in the personification of Manilov. Sorry, Manilov in personification of servility and hypocrisy. The next person he goes to is a woman, a widowed woman by the name of Korobichka, and she is the personification of ignorance and cowardice. And those are two deadly sins of Russian as well. And by the way, we can see how it goes by sort of a ladder, because Russian people are prone to servility and hypocrisy by nature, right? They are actually very ignorant of their own what inner selves, right? They're so used to being deceitful. They're so used to being they're so used to telling lies that they're just ignorant of themselves. They don't know themselves. And because they're ignorant about the world as well, they are very scared of change. So people are ignorant and coward, and that's personified in Korobichka. By the way, this name is actually that boxlet, right? That translates as boxlet. So as if she's hidden in the box and she doesn't want to change. She doesn't want to let anything in or out, right? She always is afraid that she's gonna be robbed or something. That's why she keeps the money in small, in small bags like that and in different places, right? Because she's afraid that people would steal something from her. So she's very, very scared individual, but also very ignorant. Then he goes to the third one, and my favorite one. Yeah, because I am like that. I'm sorry for that. But I am also a subject of deadly sins. Nozdrov, who is a personification of idleness and rudeness. I'm not that rude, but I'm very idle. And Nozdrov is a person who he doesn't care about anything but his own stomach. He doesn't want to do anything but gamble. It's just a person but he's also, and that's why he's called Nozdrov. He's the person who is very curious in the worst of the ways, because he always wants to know what people do, right? And yeah, so in Russian there is a phrase like "Don't put your nose in like or keep your nose out of my business," right? And Nozdrov means nose, sort of, right? It's closed there. So he's a nosy person, and that's one of the showings of his rudeness as well. And so idleness and rudeness, they come from being unable to change. Why? Because they're very afraid to change, right? Because Korobichka was the personification of cowardice. So Russian people are afraid to change. That's why they're rude, right? That's why they're idle. And next one, we already talked about him, is Sobakevich, and he is the personification of dumbness and rigidity. He is rigid. He cannot. He's not flexible at all. He's just like a stone, right? He's like a rock, and he's dumb as a rock as well, right? He is so stupid that Chichikov he doesn't know what to do with the stupidity like that. He can easily manipulate Manilov because he's so into manipulation as well, so he can understand him. He can easily manipulate Nozdrov because Nozdrov is too deep in his idleness, and so he just doesn't want to do anything. So when he says like, "Can you just sign that?" Oh, yeah, let's go away, right? And he can manipulate Korobichka because yes, she is stupid as well, but she's so afraid of anything, right? So he just says, okay, she just signs the documents. But with Sobakevich, is very difficult to work with, right? Sobakevich is very difficult to work with, and he needs to have the whole dinner to drink with him, etc., to make the deal happen. to take dead souls from Sabakevich. He's dumb and rigid. But the next one is the worst one, the most appalling one to Gogol. And we already covered his persona as well when we were discussing that keyboard like pavement, right? It's Plushkin. And he is the richest of them all. But he's messy, he's dirty, he wears the clothes like that, okay? The whole village of his is just ruins. People hate him. He is the richest of those five, but he is the cheap and he is null. And Gogol even calls him, it's the hole on the face of humanity. It's nothing. This person is nothing, right? It's the complete nullity that scares Gogol the most, and that's the last deadly sin that Gogol sees in Russian people. Unfortunately, those 9 sins before nullity, they all lead to this exact result, right? People who suffer from those 9 sins, they at the end they just become nihil, right? In Latin, there's nothing. And Plushkin was indeed nothing. Nevertheless, Chichikov wins this game of deals of different characters, right? He makes all of them sell him their dead souls. By the way, now that you know all those 5 landowners, you can see the second meaning of the name of the book, right? There are all dead souls. Those people are without souls. They're so deep into their sins, they've lost their humanity, they've lost their soul. They're just personification of sins, right? So the dead souls is first meaning of it's just the business scheme of Chichikov, but the second is more spiritual one. Those people, those 5 people, just don't have those souls. They're just shell, right? Shell without anything inside of it. And so Chichikov wins that game and that bet. He leaves that town or that province, probably that's better word. And Gogol. So now you can see why it's called Gogol's Inferno, right? It's just the descent of all those sins. But Gogol planned a trilogy. He planned his own purgatory and he planned his own paradiso, right? And he almost finished his second book, the Dead Souls second part. But then, for some reason, he burns them. He burns the second part of it, and it's never published. We have some chapters that are left from those burned pages, but they're just nothing. Of course, they don't tell us anything. And the servant of Gogol's, he said that when he saw his master burning those pages, he ran to him and said, "Stop, master!" And he just said, "Shut down, shut up, and just go and pray." Right? That was the word of Gogol to him. And next day, when he was talking to his friends, and they were just asking, "Why did you do that?" He said that I became unconscious, I became sort of possessed by the devil or by the whole ghost or by something, right? He said that I didn't know what I was doing because the second day he was, well, he was very regretful about what he did. But I think that what he did was correct. The Russian literature was not ready for the purgatory, for Gogol's purgatory, and of course it wasn't ready for Gogol's paradise. Because at the end, he planned to make this Odysseus, this Chichikov, this schemer, he planned to make him saint. He planned to sort of come back to that high understanding of Odysseus. He planned to make a savior out of Chichikov. Because in the second book, the plan was to sort of lead Chichikov through the purgatory, right? And in the third book, Chichikov would, because of his machinations and schemes, which are criminal, by the way, he was arrested and he was sent. Well, he was supposed to be sent to Siberia to the working camps, and going through that working camp experience, he would become a saint and he would become a savior, right? But for some reason, Gogol unconsciously burned that, right? Burned the second part. I think that he understood very deep, probably, but he understood that the Russian literature is not ready for that, right? There should be some generations of authors more so that Russian literature helps, or Russia as a country is ready to at least acknowledge that they are in hell, to at least see those sins that Gogol is trying to show them or point them at. And if they don't do that, or while they are not ready to see those sins, there is no way to purgatory or paradise, of course, right? So for now, we are still living in Gogol's, well, not we per se, but Russia is still living in Gogol's inferno, right? And whenever Russia sees those sins and Russian people see those sins in themselves, that's going to change the way the history goes. So that's the end of the lecture itself. I just wanted to sort of recap the main idea. So this Ukrainian-born Russian author, because he was never writing in Ukrainian, and he even said once that and I'm not sure if people are gonna like that, but it's his words. He said that Slavic literature is possible only in Russian because it's the language of Pushkin, and he said that the language of Pushkin is evangelical. Right? He said that the language that Pushkin invented was evangelical. It was the language of a new beginning, right? And that's why he chose to write only in Russian. He never wrote in Ukrainian. But he was born in Ukraine, and he loved those parts of his life as well as St. Petersburg. He loved being in St. Petersburg, near Pushkin, of course. But his love for those free peasants, right? Because in Russia they were enslaved peasants, but in Ukraine there were mostly free people. Again, Cossacks and those free people of Ukraine. He loved them. He loved those small people. He loved those village people. He loved all of that. He loved that magical and mystical thinking of those village people, because people who live, well, on land, right, close to the ground, they're all a little magical and mystical, right? But people in big cities, they become invisible because of the system. They become weak and frail because of the system. The system sort of tries to digest them and just throws them away whenever they die, and no one even notices that fact. As in the Overcoat, when they noticed that Akaki Akakevich was dead, they just replaced him with another one, right? That no one was worrying about that. So that person who was so full of fun, being a jester by his nature, being born on April the 1st, goes to this claustrophobic, huge city, right? Becomes a poet of that city. He shows those invisible, those miserable, those desperate people from St. Petersburg or in any other big city. He shows their lives, and then he becomes worthy of being called not only a poet of the Ukrainian village, not only a poet of a big city, but a poet of the whole country, but a poet of the whole world. And I would dare to say that his level of genius is on par with Shakespeare, Goethe, Dante, Homer, but for some reason he is not that much well known in the Western world like his descendants, right? Literary descendants, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Chekhov. And I hope that I was able to put a little seed of interest into your hearts and minds, and you will come and read Gogol and see that those three giants that we usually know and like, they all come from his overcoat. Thank you.